Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston, the author of The Second Bell, a Slavic fantasy novel about a striga and her mother.
And I'm Caroline Hardaker, the author of Composite Creatures, a dystopian twisty tale coming out in April 2021.
And this is Bookish Take, when we talk about our writing process from the initial ideas to the scary days of submitting and beyond. And today we're doing something slightly different. We have with us Chris Panatier, the author of Phlebotomist, what he himself likes to describe as a fantopia, as well as the upcoming novel, The Stringers. And hi, Chris, thanks for joining us. So.
Hi.
Can you quickly,
Thanks for having me.
Can you quickly explain what your novel is about?
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to spoil it because if I go past page 80, I will spoil it. But basically, the setup is it's a near future sci-fi where that follows a grandmother, 67-year-old Willa Wallace, who works as a reaper or a blood collector for the government blood collector, a company called Patriot, that collects the mandatory blood donations that everybody has to give in support of a war effort. And this has led to a society that is segregated by blood type. And it devolves from there. She works for the company that's doing it, and she figures out some stuff that doesn't look quite right. And that's where I'll leave it.
So that's brilliant. So both Caroline and Chris have written novels within the subcategory of medical dystopia. So what prompted both of you to explore that aspect of our societies? So Caroline, your book is a medical dystopia as well, could be described as such. So can you sort of...
Yeah, definitely. I guess with me, it happened kind of a bit organically, to be honest. At the very beginning, I started by thinking about it as something a little bit different. So initially it was going to be simply about, and I say simply because I'd never written a novel before, so I didn't really know how many layers I would even put into it. But at the beginning, it was just going to be about our connections with nature and wildlife in a world where wildlife is disappearing. And then it was as I started to write it, really, and I realized it was taking a very, in some aspects, like a body horror turn, and I needed to justify certain plot things that happen. It became a lot more medical, and I started to look into kind of the NHS, because it's based in England, privatisation of healthcare. And as I was doing some research, I realised that, at least here in the UK, we're already on the cusp of a lot of these things happening. So it's not too hard to actually research them. And also I'm sort of mostly interested for me writing stories that are on the verge of just about to happen. So you can almost imagine them being real. So they're not too much a leap. And that's kind of how I got to it, to be honest. It started off as one thing and sort of merged into another. But I don't know, what about you, Chris?
I think it's not as much of a leap, sort of, in terms of thinking of medical dystopia specifically and where you are, isn't it?
And at the end, I think we're all, when I was writing, I just became really aware of the fact that we are, it sounds obvious, but we are just biological creatures ourselves. We are just bodies. We're walking organic machines. And the themes, I won't say too much again because it probably would spoil my book too, but the themes that I go along just naturally take you in a sort of medical direction, to be honest. It's probably a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's the truth.
And you, Chris, what do you think?
I think I gravitated towards dystopia because if I was going to tell a story about the world and have it be realistic, that's just the truth. And that to me is a little depressing, but I look around and that's what I see is a dystopia. And of course I wrote this in the second year of the Trump administration here in the US. And so I was inspired by Donald Trump in a way,
See,
I guess.
some goods come out of it.
I guess. And I wrote a world that I was like, this world could very well happen if we continue on this slide we're on. So to me, it's just, it sounds very dark, but I don't have a lot of huge faith in humankind. I think that there are far more people who are good than are bad, but it's the bad ones that have what it takes to take and hold control. So they're the ones that tend to steer the ship, even if everyone else on the ship are good. And so that's kind of where it started. Now, moving on from that, it's a lot of fun, and fun things happen in it. And I did describe it as a funtopia because I can't help but inject my sense of humor into things. But yeah, so like Caroline said, we both wrote things that were very possible. Now mine takes an additional kind of jump into another area.
But we don't want to spoil it.
Right, so. into another sort of tropey thing, but it's also done in sort of a credible way. I wanted all the science to be real science, and I read Caroline's book and found that to be something that they both had in common, even though the approaches were totally different, which was pretty cool. They were kind of different sides of the same coin in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Chris
actually,
I
was sorry. Sorry. I was just going to expand on something Chris said and just say that I felt the same way when you said that sounds awful, but you don't necessarily think the best of human nature in many ways, and you think people are most people are good, but the people in charge tend to not be. But then also I totally agree. And then there was another aspect of that which I was thinking of constantly when I was writing Composite Creatures, which was that I'm really interested in what everyday normal people choose to do when they're presented with a big choice, because I think most people are quite amoral. I don't know whether I think they're good necessarily. It's more to do with, I think people just do what they're told to do. So I wanted to kind of explore what people like us might do if you're presented with quite an odd choice.
Good is in the eye of a beholder a lot, I think.
Yeah, totally.
And I think amoral is a much better characterization than good versus bad, because, I think most people, probably the better way to put it is most people will not go out of their way to do evil. But I do agree that most will kind of just go in the broad general direction in which they're pointed. So that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think most people think they're good, perhaps, but you're living under your own rules, aren't you, really? So anyway.
Yeah.
So you both have kind of answered the next question, but just to sort of reiterate quickly, I found that both of your books have themes of what happens when medical care is not seen as a human right. So for Caroline, like, is this the direction you think we're going, or like for Chris, is this where you think you are, like in the US at the moment, or do you think you can? There's a way sort of out of that, like.
I would say in the UK, then yes. So, when I first started writing it was a few years ago, and there was less on the news about the privatization of the NHS at the time, but since then it's just been more and more. And I think there's been the NHS has had a bit of a new lease of life with COVID happening, all the clapping and all of that. And I don't know whether it would make a difference to the government at all in terms of them selling it off piece by piece, but it does seem to be heading in that direction for the UK, which is really sad. But like in other bits of the world, like the US, it's already there, really. So it's very probable, I think, which is awful.
Yeah, it's funny. I follow several UK like Twitter accounts, and probably prior to 4 years ago, I saw just a lot of cheerleading about the NHS and how people loved it and all of that. And then I see that it's getting parceled out. But before that, people would compare the US healthcare system with the NHS, and I would just lament what we have here, because here we do live in, in the Phlebotomist, I have a society segregated on something that people don't really think about much, which is just a genetic roll of the dice on what your blood type is. And so I wanted to have a way to segregate people that wasn't traditional, that people would go, wait, but that has nothing to do with my merit or my socioeconomic or anything traditional. But we kind of already, we have that here in the US when it comes to healthcare. If you can afford, and what's crazy is you may actually have a good job, and you might make decent money here in the US, but one large or catastrophic thing happens and you are bankrupt. One thing. And so even if you have good healthcare, one thing can derail everything here in the US and you can be bankrupt. So
do you think there's much of an appetite to sort of change it around to kind of avoid that extreme dystopian sort of scenario in the United States?
There is, and it goes back to my initial point, which is we no longer have representative government here. We have gerrymandered government. So our country is ruled by the minority, and it has been ruled by the minority for a long time. And even though, as we speak, the majority has the House, Senate, and the White House, it is still being derailed on a day-to-day basis by the minority because of how powerful they've become and because of how they do business, which is pretty crooked. But we are beholden to the minority. The majority of Americans are in favor of reasonable gun control, $15 minimum wage, universal health care. Why don't we have those things? Because a minority has been in control who is against those things.
That's, well, I suppose something else has to change quite drastically for that to be turned around then. But
yeah.
So going back to the novels, so the scale of both novels is vastly different, even though they are both self-contained, relatively short novels. So Composite Creatures is intimate in scale and very introspective, while the Phlebotomist goes wider and gives us a view of the society as a whole, as well as a communal response to the situation in a book. So why and how did you each choose the scope of the novels? Maybe let's start with Chris this time.
For me, this is such a weird answer, but I always come back to this. I want to push the walls and the limits of everything I do as far as I can possibly reach. And when I write short fiction, it tends to be super intimate, super, super, super intimate. But when I write bigger stuff, novel stuff, I listen to a lot of progressive metal, and those guys sing about, floating around in the ether in a spaceship, lost for eons and turning into a robot. I mean, just whatever. They're willing to go to places where sort of mainstream entertainment won't. And I try to think about how can I keep breaking molds and try to push it as far as I can. So that's naturally what my kind of default mental state was in writing The Phlebotomist, which was I wanted to create something that was realistic, but then push it as far as I can, but still hold the reader's interest, not just go, oh, now everybody is a robot. Nothing like that, nothing like super crazy. It's got to be a cohesive story, but I wanted to make it broad. I wanted it to be wide ranging. And I really like the setup of sort of, here's the bad guy. Is he really the bad guy, or is this the bad guy? Is there a bigger bad guy? So I love the idea of the big bad too, and of long game stuff. So I always try to set up a lot of my stories in that way, where there's a pivot point at some point, and maybe you change perspectives, or maybe the guy you thought was really bad really isn't nearly as bad as you thought they were. This other thing is even worse. So that tends to scale things up.
What about you, Caroline?
Well, that sounds really tricksy. I love that. I love tricking readers. With me, like where Chris was saying, trying to do something new each time, and widening the scope every time. I'm like that, but almost in reverse, in that I want to try something new every time, but I feel like every time I'm going to write something, I can almost see it now. I'm trying to just go deeper into a headspace, I suppose, because I love writing in first person. I think pretty much everything I could imagine writing at the moment is in first person. And I think that's just because I love the psychology of how people think about things. So in terms of Composite Creatures, which is first person, the intimate scale just felt very natural because it is a very intimate story. It's all in Nora's head, and it all just everything that happens in it is the stuff that she encounters in everyday life. So in terms of world building and things like that, I had to try and even bigger society stuff going on at the time in that world, I had to sort of try and infuse in with like subtle news reports that you would see in the background, or a bit of a magazine cover or something like that. And I just think I'm just really interested in the fact that everything that she encounters in the story, which takes you to this other world, is something that matters to her. And I can see me doing that again and again and again, but I'm trying to get even more psychological with each time. So like as I go along, especially with Nora, actually, one thing that I wanted people to think about when they were reading it, because you're literally listening to her tell her story, is kind of why is she telling you it? And, you know, how is she telling you it? And what does she really think? Is she being a bit tricksy like Chris, or is she naive? So that's where I go down the
So you're interested in the reliability of a narrator as well, when you sort of scale it down. And like, do you think there's a trade-off in terms of, you know, the scale you chose when you're describing a dystopian society as a whole as well, and you're creating this vision of a future? Do you find that like scaling it down to that sort of pinpoint of Nora's mind, do you lose something, or?
I don't think you do, but I think it's, for me, I find it, I don't know actually, because maybe it wouldn't be more difficult, but I think it's more difficult to infuse the wider scale stuff, world building stuff, which you do need so that people understand what's actually going on in the world. Otherwise, the stuff that Nora says will just be entirely random. So trying to infuse it in those like little news reports and things can get quite repetitive if you don't keep mixing it up. So I guess that's the only trade-off really. You've got to constantly find little ways of putting it in without doing a big exposition dump, which is very tempting, because Nora, being her voice, she could just tell you, she could just say, oh, and then the NHS is being privatized. But why would she tell you that? Because she presumes
prior knowledge. Yeah,
well, you would presume if it was real that she is telling her story to someone that lives there then as well, so she wouldn't have to tell you that. So it's constantly trying to, like, I suppose it's my marketing head from working in marketing. It's like trying to think about what the audience already knows and what they would know if they were in that situation. So yeah, you have to get a bit psychological doing it, but I would say the only trade-off is not being able to describe the grander stuff. I can only describe what Nora has seen.
What about you, Chris? Do you think that, like, in terms of going slightly more epic, do you think there's some kind of conscious sacrifice in terms of, like, I don't know, if it's like character development or getting, you know, more closer to the kind of relationships between the characters? Do you think that some of those trade-offs are necessary when you go wider, or can you recommend?
I think that everything you can do with third person limited omniscient, well, no, everything you could do with first person, you can also do with third person limited omniscient, but it allows you to go more broad. So the Phlebotomist is, for the most part, Willow's point of view. It's third person limited omniscient. It's just her. It's
focalized for her, yeah.
Right. And there is some internal, you have her thoughts, you have that. As Caroline was talking, I was thinking, you know, in reading her book, it's very interesting because with first person, some would say it's unfiltered, and it is very unfiltered from what you're getting from that first person, but it's incredibly filtered for what that person is receiving.
Yes.
And so that is a really cool kind of dichotomy. See, you don't get that in the third person limited omniscient, because the reader sees what she sees, what Willa sees. And then I also give you Willa's thoughts. So she's kind of placed in check with everything that's going on. You can't really have her be an unreliable narrator because you see what she sees. Whereas with Nora, you definitely get that sense that, I mean, you're only getting what she's getting. So that's a really interesting kind of contrast. But in my new book that will come out next year, I have one POV that's first person point of view and one that is third. And it's a big epic space thing. And the first person, I actually had to bring his best friend along, who I initially had killed off, but now I resurrected him, and he now comes along, because when I have this first person main character going through all this stuff, there's virtually no sense of the scale beyond what he can see and perceive. And it was also getting boring because he spends a lot of time in captivity, and there was only so much like internal stuff I could do. And I was like, I gotta bring a sidekick. So I had to fix that. But that was how I was really limited. If I had written that in third person, even limited, I would have had access to a lot more. So I had to solve that problem. And I experienced this challenge where Caroline says she really likes writing first person, and she's used to that. And could she do what she wants to do writing third? I kind of had the opposite thing where I was like, okay, now I've got a series of things I have to accomplish. And can I do that with first person? And I think ultimately I got there, but I had to use some little tricks.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because during the drafting process, I think I was, it was when I'd finished the first draft and I was just about to start the second draft. And I've described before my stupid process for writing a second draft. Basically, Chris, I rewrite the whole thing from scratch and I start from the middle. And I remember which chapter I was starting on. And I tried writing it in third person just to see how it would change the whole thing. And I quite liked the tone, but I found like I didn't even enjoy it as much for some reason. I think I quite like the idea that I think I must be a bit of a struggling actress as well, because I want to play that character. And also I quite like that idea of telling the story, but then hopefully making people think they don't know if I'm lying or not, because the whole thing could be a lie as far as you know.
From some perspectives, sometimes it's just right for the story, because Caroline, I did the same thing with Stringers. The first person character, I wrote it what was in my head from the start was first person, and in fact first person present, which I wrote 100 pages in first person present, and finally I was like, when there's action, it's like way awkward. It's really weird. So I changed it to first person past, and that worked. But then I did rewrite a few chapters in third, and I just went, it doesn't feel right in third. He's got to be first person. So it's so funny to hear you say that, because I tried the same thing, and it was a totally different story.
Yeah, it changes the tone completely as well when it's past to present even. I tried writing in present, first person present recently, and I've carried on because I've got better at it. But I find it really hard as well. Yeah. I find like things sound odd. I don't know, like it makes more sense to me that someone is telling the story retrospectively and they're telling it because they want to convince you of something or something. But I find it hard to get into my head the sound that someone would say, so the sound that someone would make when they're just narrating their process of going day to day. Right. It was really odd.
Well, and especially if you have action, like I have a lot of action. It's a space thing, so there's action.
Yeah.
And it's like I got hit on the head, I slid across, I grunted. It was just I grunt, I slide across, right. And it just sounds like, wait, so it in your head as the reader, you're almost seeing a guy and this stuff's happening to him, and he's looking at you going, I'm grunting, I'm sliding, I just got shot by a laser, whatever it is. And it just didn't work.
It just, you have to try those things to sort of figure out what the right, like sometimes you want to know from the beginning what the right type of narration is. And I've had it as well where I changed types of narration sort of, you know, a chapter in because just it wasn't working. So but it's really interesting how you both of you had like a different process because you were trying to accomplish different things in terms of how the narrator is perceived and how much of their world you wanted to show. So sort of more in terms of the research aspect of your books. You know, a lot, you've both said, you know, that like a lot of the dystopian elements that you've introduced are things that you can already observe around you. And did you have to research a lot in terms of drawing on contemporary and historical inspirations? Caroline?
Not really.
No. That's a quick answer. That's good.
There's a bit, I suppose. Like there's certain things that I'm always a bit inspired by, to be honest, and they're not even science fiction related. So I read a lot of like Japanese translated fiction, and I really love it's like a kind of often there's like a slow kind of melancholic tone to it. I'm not sure where it comes from necessarily, but I'm quite inspired by that. And whenever I've read something else along those lines, it makes me want to tell a story instead, a completely different story probably, but I don't know, there's something about it. It's quite lyrical, it's quite poetic. And saying that, I think I'm quite inspired by a lot of poetry still, to be honest, just because I love the sound that it makes more than anything else. And I think that's why I ended up being a poet, was because it's like music without the music. And that helped me write the novel, to be honest. If I hadn't done all the poetry stuff, there's no way I could have written a novel. And the other inspiration, I'll say from a history point of view, is Frankenstein, because I'm pretty inspired by Frankenstein in literally everything. Like I think that novel does have flaws. Look at that, it's right there. You had it all along. Yeah, I mean, it gets a bit dodgy towards the end, in my opinion, but basically it was the first of its kind. And yeah, I can't get into the headspace where nothing like that had really been written before. And then she did write it, and how much of a jolt that must have been in those times. And I just, yeah, it sticks in my head so much, and I think it probably inspires everything I write, to be honest.
Yeah. You know, finding new ways to make it sadder is basically what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about that connection, but and it would be wrong to say that your book is Frankenstein-like. That would send the wrong message. But there are threads of it in your book for sure. You know, yours is way more realistic. Frankenstein cracks me up, frankly, because I love this guy. He's a monster. He's been sewn together. He spends a few weeks in a hut out behind someone's house, and he speaks the king's English like beautifully, right?
Yeah, Paradise Lost.
Yes, I mean it's so funny, but I see that, and your prose, by the way, is just breathtaking, so good. Aww. And it's gorgeous.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, but it cracks me up as well. It's particularly the sort of chase through the ice caps which gets me. And also, I always thought Frankenstein was quite wet. He just faints all the time. Everything puts him into a faint. Like, get a grip. You got yourself into this situation. But actually, maybe a lot of science fiction could just be based on it, because it's like that modern Prometheus thing. It's like reaching too far. And I think a lot of science fiction is based on that, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know you did a lot of research on blood, but that seems to form the basis of your.
I did learn a lot about blood reading this. I have to say.
Oh, phenomenal! So, well, yeah. I mean,
was there something else that you sort of researched in? Yes, you can have a fruit.
Yeah, I mean, now obviously blood was the big thing, because I was trying to set it. I was trying to make it right. And so I had to really, really make sure it was right. And I approached a lot of people and was ignored by most of them. One person, a blood expert professional, ended up talking with me enough to make me go, okay, I think I've got this correct. Because I always thought there were just ABO blood groups. There's actually like 300, but ABO is ABO is the most reactive. So that's the one that everyone like keeps track of, because if you get the wrong one of those, it's bad news. But other areas, I've talked about in the past that I was not super well read in fiction before my 30s, before my late 30s. It's not what I read. And it was one of those late blooming interests for me. And so so much of what I've written so far did not have a lot of influences. And I certainly don't mean that to be glib, because the worst thing you can do is go, I created something new, and no, you didn't. But when I wrote this, I did create that sort of society from whole cloth. I didn't know anything to create it from. So there was a lot of thinking and a lot of brainstorming, trying to make sure that the economics worked and that the way the society was set up was credible. And if I had been taking from something else, maybe it would have been easier, but I sort of tried to create that from the ground up in a credible way. The book I'm writing now, I'm borrowing influence from lots and lots and lots of space stuff. The Expanse and Old Man's War and Gate Crashers and Murderbot, and just all of this stuff I really, really love, have taught me how to sort of block out and sketch a space thing. But not so much for Phlebotomist.
I think it'll be very comforting for a lot of people to actually hear what you said about sort of being a late bloomer when it comes to reading fiction, because it's something that is quite specific to men as well. But the majority of fiction readers are women. Something like 80% of fiction books are bought by women. And I think there's this sense still that, for men, it's like, men should read nonfiction. Men should read something they can monetize or, improve their position. Something efficiency and that storytelling is not as valued in a kind of Western understanding of masculinity. And I think that there are a lot of people who have this sort of sense that they would quite like to become fiction readers, and they just don't have that maybe confidence that this is something that it's like, I missed the boat. And it's really quite inspiring to hear someone say I never really read much fiction, but now I'm a writer.
Well, see, and I'll tell you exactly why I didn't. And it was a very naive and ignorant view. I had this idea in my head that until you learned everything there was to learn about the world in a real way, what was the point? And that's so stupid. I mean, I grew out of it, thank God, because what I've realized more and more and more is that the way you learn about our world in so many ways is by reading fiction. That's how you actually learn about the world. Not just the author, but perspectives and all sorts of things that you would have to wait for in the real world to come along and see the lesson and learn the lesson, where you can learn all there is to know about human nature by reading the fiction they write. So obviously I understood, I came to understand that. But in a way, for what I'm interested in, for science fiction, in a way, it was good that I read a bunch of nonfiction, because the nonfiction I was interested in tended to be astronomy, astrophysics, super complex stuff that I understand 5% of, but enough to credibly write science fiction, I hope. And so it gave me this groundwork that could percolate and then turn into a fictional story. But yeah, so that's where I kind of came from, and it's very interesting. Have you guys seen the movie Sideways?
No, but I know what it is. but no,
right? It's Paul Giamatti and his friend go on his bachelor weekend to wine country, and Paul Giamatti is a big wine snob. He's also a writer, and they meet the father of the fiance before they go on their trip, and the father says, he's a very practical businessman, and he says to the best man, he says to the best man who's the author, he says, what are you writing? And he says, well, it's an exploration of this relationship, yada yada, it's fiction. And he goes, I don't understand why you would read anything outside of what we can see and perceive in the real world. It's just a waste of time. And Paul Giamatti says, that's an interesting perspective. But that's the perspective I used to have. I used to think, what a waste of time to read stories. I mean, isn't that sad? But anyway, I grew out of it. And now my daughter, I am making sure that she starts there. That is where we are starting. And that's what she does. So she won't be coming from a place of disadvantage in terms of what I had put in my head that I did.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like I would never say that I was particularly well read, but it's for completely different reasons. So I read loads as a kid and a teenager, all the time. And then I did English literature at university, not creative writing, just literature. So being at uni and doing English literature and reading kind of 3 novels a week, or 4 sometimes, just completely sickened me from reading for pleasure. And then I would say it took me nearly 10 years after that to be able to read again, for the joy of it. And I didn't even know where to start. And that was probably only like 5 years ago or something, 4 or 5 years ago. So since then, I've just tried to read stuff across all genres. So even though I'm writing science fiction, and my next novel that I'm working on now is also science fiction, though it's a bit weird, so I'm not really sure yet. I would say that I'm not particularly well read in science fiction at all, but I don't know. I'm trying to be better read. I think all authors have to read as much as they can just to learn about tone and words and everything else. But yeah, so
especially
I just wanted to...
if you choose to read, like, you know, I mean, honestly, I don't really read much science fiction just because this isn't like my main area of interest. And there's so many books coming out in my main areas of interest that I just run out of time. Yeah. But it's so, you're right. It's so important to kind of be well read in the area that you want to explore, because you can... There's certain expectations, but also there's this whole world, like Chris mentioned before, like all those things that have been done before and that you could reference in a knowing way or accidentally copy without realizing. And it's just...
Totally. And I just think it's good for people to know, if they're wanting to try writing a novel or something, that, you know, it can do them a lot of good to read stuff in their genre, but they shouldn't worry about not having read the last 20 years worth, because there's no need. We're all the same.
So do you guys have like any thoughts about how, when you were starting writing a book specifically, was this concept of social political commentary like very intrinsic to your story idea? Was this something that you set out like, you know, I'm really angry about this, I really want to kind of explore it in a sort of less didactic, perhaps, you know, sort of way that doesn't feel on the nose, but still sort of explores it? Or did you start from a different point? What about you, Caroline?
So yeah, I suppose so. I guess it's what I said before. So I really intended to write about a dying sort of natural world, to be honest. It was quite environmental, the things that I was trying to tackle originally. So, you know, things that are currently in the news, to be honest, like microplastics, even, you know, our disposable face masks washing up on shores all around the world now, species becoming extinct every day, that kind of thing was originally what I was trying to tackle. And it was our connection to all of that and how we might connect to nature when it is dying in future generations, say. But then I was also really interested in a different side of it, being that again, it's the psychological aspect. So I think I really wanted to explore memory. And it's like what Chris was saying before about first person and the filter idea, is that when something's told from a memory, it's already distorted, and it's distorted for our ears when we are told it, but is it even distorted for her when she's telling her story? So I think I was quite interested in looking at bias and memory, emotional memory, and how people twist their own story to justify the sometimes terrible end that they come to. So that was me. And then it was only later that I started to dip into more the privatization of the NHS and so on, like that. Yeah, that was me.
What about you, Chris?
I think, I think when we start writing long fiction, you don't always set out with a thematic goal. And I didn't have a thematic goal when I started out, but it very quickly presented itself. And I think that's just because of who you are comes out, right? And some people will say, boy, there's a theme here. I didn't even realize there was a theme, right? Well, yeah, that makes sense though, because we all have our sensibilities and our opinions, and I think they slowly sort of emerge. And ultimately, in the Phlebotomist, I'm hammering the reader over the head with a lot of political commentary. I mean, it's all about socioeconomic inequality. It's about authoritarianism. It's about rights to self-determination, consent, everything, and it's very much a blunt instrument. And I kind of meant it that way. I was fine with that rather than doing a more subtle thing, because that tends to be sort of my personality. And also it lent itself to sort of the over the top, some of the action, some of the characters. It just sort of fit to do it that way. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say it was somewhat satirical, but it wasn't a hard satire. So it had a little touch, like in some of the violent scenes, I go a little over the top with some of the violence because it's fun. But it's got just a touch of Starship Troopers almost. Like Starship Troopers was way satirical, like over the top crazy. And I just sort of nudged that just a little bit because I wanted it to still feel realistic and have people identify with the characters. But yeah, I mean, I very quickly within the first 20 pages had a dynamic of rich versus poor and haves and have-nots very quickly. And so I went, I did that.
Oh, I love it even more now that I know it's channeling Starship Troopers in a way, because I love that too.
I mean, I'm a huge Starship Troopers fan. That is pure gold for me. So
yeah, I want to watch that now. Mm-hmm. I'm in the mood.
It is.
And just sort of to wrap things up, do you guys think you might go back to the world of your novel again? Do you think that there is a story there that you would like to explore? What do you think, Chris?
Well, definitely there's room for another book or two with the Phlebotomist. It was planned that way. It, like you said at the beginning of our discussion, it is, for the most part, I don't think any book should be totally tied up, even purely standalones. I think life isn't really like that. Pixar is like that. And Pixar is a good way to learn how to write an arc and all of that, but it ties everything up like perfectly. And real life isn't like that. So I left a few things open. The arc of the story is taken care of. It's done. But there's more out there, and I already have it mapped out and partially written, and we'll see if it ever finds a home. I also have written half of a prequel, the origin story, if you will, that takes place 200 years earlier in a California gold mine.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah. I really hope that finds a home, because it's so different, but it explains how it all happened, and I really, really love it. So anyway, we'll see if that finds a home.
Yeah, having read it,
write it, and I'll definitely read it.
Okay.
Yeah, me too. Please, yeah, just send it to us.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Thanks.
I'd love.
But
I
you
would
have
love
two dedicated readers already.
Yay.
What about you, Caroline? Do you think you might go back? I know that you have all those wonderful projects that you've already sort of started on. But do you think that you might go back to, if not Nora, then Nora's world?
Well, yeah, I think with Nora, I think her story is tied up. Like her story is done. I'm not going to say
Not give too much away.
No, it certainly doesn't tie up in a Pixar-esque manner. But yeah, there's nothing else to say on her. She's told her story herself, and that is all she wants to tell, I think. And I feel like if I told anyone else's story from the same world, it wouldn't shed any new light on anything. Let's put it that way. So probably not. You probably could do something. You could do something from inside Eastern Grove, which is the big private healthcare organization. But yeah, I'm not feeling it yet. I'm not feeling it. I kind of like the idea of the norm, like me and you telling the story when they encounter these things. So I don't think I'll be going back to that world. I think if I did, it would end up being quite plot driven. And at the moment, I'm much more interested in just...
You're not fired up by the idea of going back to it.
No, and I mean, loads of people want loads of plot, but unfortunately, that's not really what motivates me, for better or for worse. Yeah, I think I want to be an explorer and explore some new worlds and new terrains. So I think, at least for the foreseeable, I'll be heading in different directions.
The way that yours was written was very enlightening to me, because I am plot, and just plot. I mean, when I turned in Phlebotomist, it was 68,000 words. It ended up being 92,000. So it was very much thickened up in terms of character and world building and all of that. It was just plot. And so reading yours, I was like, oh, so this is how you do it if you really want an introspective journey of a person and you want to spend time there. And I learned a lot from that, and have like, I made a mental note. I've carried that forward in some of the stuff I'm working on now. Not to like, because I'm Mr. Plot. Like, I love plot. I love twists. I love all sorts of stuff. But sometimes you have to sit and breathe a little bit. And I was thinking about that a lot as I was reading yours, and to do that, to have that introspection and just that internal world for an entire novel, and do it in such a way that forced people to keep turning the pages is a really amazing accomplishment. So I thought it was tremendous. And I think I mentioned that yours felt like a microcosm almost of a Philip K. Dick world, the poisoned world, but just a small little piece of it. And it hinted at the broader stuff. Anyway, I can't say enough good things about it. I really.
That's so nice. Well, not to make
best recommendation.
I was going to say, not to make it like a mutual gushing session. I learned a lot from this also, because I actually find plot really difficult. I find it really easy to rattle off someone's point of view. Like, I must have like about 50 different personalities in my head all at once, which is why I can do it, which is worrying, but true. But if I was trying to write something which was really action-based, exciting, and really carries you through, and this is like a page turner, I don't know if I could do it. Like, one day I might try, but I don't think I could do it as good as this, because it would end up just going back into being a little thoughtful. I've got to think about this decision for a few pages, and it's like, oh, well, that's not plot anymore, is it? So
you can't find who you are.
It's true, but yeah, I have total admiration for that. Like, I wish I could, but I can't.
There you go, guys. Everyone watching, buy the Phlebotomist and Composite Creatures, and
I will say,
compare and contrast.
Yeah, I will say, I noticed when these were on my bookshelves that they have really coordinated spines.
Oh, look at that. They do.
It just goes together. That's a sign.
Yeah. So if you get one, you got to get the other.
Let's just go ahead and tell people that they're actually just part of a series.
They look like they are. Yeah, mine could be the prequel and yours is the sequel. Okay.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Gabriela.
Thank you. Bye.